There we go. Don't let that cause you to be shy about questions you might have. I really would like to know what I can dive deeper into. So today is two separate 4-hour trainings. Some of you are here just for the first 4 hours. All 8 hours do count for the original crisis intervention, mental illness, officer wellness mandated training hours. I confirmed with the post board. It sounds like pretty soon there's going to be a new process that anybody who provides training will have to go through to become an approved provider, to deliver the new mandates that legislation came up with. They were kind of adjusted from the old ones, and so we will figure that out when we get to it. So I want to get going here. I'll just start with a little bit of background about me. So I got my social work degree in 2010 from the University of Nebraska in Omaha, and I opened my practice in 2017. So we're going on the 4th year. I used to work in child protection as an ongoing case manager, and then also on the psychiatric crisis team at Hennepin County. So throughout all of the work I've done with my master's degree and prior, there was always a thread of trauma in the work that I did. It seemed to underlie a lot of what I was doing and the help that I was providing to people. So I decided to open my own practice and specialize in trauma treatment. And from there, it pretty quickly evolved into working with first responders. So I had been working with the Minneapolis Police Department at the 5th Precinct on some wellness programming. They added me to their list of clinicians who officers would be given to go and choose from and see. And then I started training, and the Chiefs Association, I worked with them and trained. We had a partnership, and that got me all over the state, really. And I have a lot of fun doing training. From that exposure, Blaine Police Department asked me to be their police therapist, and then other agencies picked up on these ideas and went from there. So I am also a registered yoga teacher. We will talk a lot about the way that stress and trauma sits in our physical body as muscle tension. There's a direct effect between your physical health and wellness and agility and strength and balance and your mental health. And we'll talk about all about how there are lots of connections there with the nervous system and our mental health. So that was the reason for that training. Outside of work, I have 2 kids. My son is 14 and my daughter is 12. And we like to travel and get away whenever we can. Adventure, lots of road trips in the summers. My son has, in the past year, gotten into mountain biking. So I just kind of follow them, their passions, keep up with them, and do whatever is needed to stay connected as they grow up. So these are the post board objectives for today. We are in this first 4 hours covering an understanding of mental health for police officers. So we're going to do kind of a deep dive into this particular aspect of those mandated pieces. And I just took the opportunity to take that one section of those mandates and expand on it and get it post-board approved. If you're staying for the second 4 hours, we're going to get much more into crisis intervention, mental illness, and the application of a lot of what I'm setting up in this first 4 hours to your work with the community. And my approach really is to explain from a social work perspective, a mental health perspective, what that all looks like, how the lens that I look at that through, and really also the way that I did my work on the psychiatric crisis team in the community, working with those who were suicidal or actively psychotic, and I'll share some of that with you. My approach is kind of take what you want and leave the rest, and hopefully you find something, if not many things from today, helpful for you personally and professionally. So right now we are working with over 40 public safety agencies in Minnesota. I started kind of bringing on staff and building our team as more and more agencies were asking for assistance. I'm not great at saying no, so I just have built this team of fantastic clinicians. who I've trained and worked alongside for quite some time now. And so we are able to do a lot of work in Minnesota. In addition to post-training and wellness programming, I also provide clinical consultations for a couple of crisis negotiation teams in the Southern Metro, and then also for peer support teams, for multiple peer support teams in Minnesota. So I have, in this past maybe 6 months, just been starting out by talking about the past year. It's kind of hard to ignore the fact that the past year has been really difficult for multiple reasons. It's taken a toll on the broader public, on law enforcement specifically, and I want to just begin by explaining why, from a brain science perspective, it's been so hard. So there are 3 things that our brains really like to have, and those are called duration, path, and outcome. We really like to know how long something is going to last. We want to know what it's going to be like while it's happening, which is path. And then we like to know the outcome. We like to know how things are going to turn out. And when we have those 3 pieces of information, we feel the best. And so that right there might just explain to you why the last year has been so hard. From a COVID perspective, from a social unrest perspective, and it's been very chronic. It's been ongoing, and that also takes quite a toll on our brains. So we certainly are working with a lot of officers, and have been for some time here, who are feeling the effects of these exact pieces that we're missing, as far as duration, path, and outcome. And what we end up talking about a lot is control. So why do we feel so out of control? Normalizing how awful it feels when we are out of control, feeling out of control. And then what do we have control of? And so with what's been going on, there is commonly feelings of insecurity, worry, anxiety, and it can permeate professional and personal lives. So essentially, it can feel like we're on a roller coaster. The ups and downs, the turns, the twists, sometimes even upside down. And the thing about being on a roller coaster is you have no control. In fact, sometimes on a roller coaster, you can see what's coming up, which may even be slightly easier than what we've been going through. But the way that one can step off that roller coaster feeling is to look at it like this. I use a lot of imagery and metaphors. That's kind of the way I think. So I hope that that works for you as well. But essentially, this circle here, the blue one, represents everything. And if you're wondering, well, what do you mean everything? What about X, Y, and Z? Yes, that too. So just everything. What can we control is here in a very magnified version. I've made this little dot in the corner, and that's actually a blown up version of what can actually control. So the first step to getting some relief is taking hold of what you can truly control. And there are only 4 things. So there are thoughts, attitude, effort, and actions. Your thoughts, you can choose them like you choose your clothes each morning. Your attitude is something that it's a perspective you take, it's a lens you decide to look at the world through, and you also have control over that. Effort is something you can choose to put towards whatever you have prioritized, and then the actions you take are also in your control. So when you truly have a grasp on these 4 things, you then have a stronger sense of control, but also a stronger influence on those around you. You really can't help but have an influence on those around you. We are so interconnected and interdependent, and I'll talk about the ways that our brains actually influence each other very heavily. But this is why there's this saying that you become like the 5 people you spend the most time around. They influence you, you influence them. And so being very aware of that is an important piece. There are those who are not doing well. There are those who are doing really well. And then there are those who are not doing well and are influencing others in an unhelpful way. And so I like to just make sure to make those distinctions because it is so important. And it's important that we are all very aware of the effect we're having on others. I wish people in the general public were more aware of the effect that their words have on others, but that's not something I can take on today. So, big picture, we're talking in these first 4 hours and really throughout the day, if you're staying for the second 4, is resilience, stress, trauma. We'll also be talking about mental health and crisis intervention later on, but it all ties in. So, what fuels resilience? Resilience is the ability to bounce back, kind of like a rubber band. It can be stretched and then it will return. So, resilience assumes that difficult things are going to happen, but it's also what allows for you to come back from them or even to build on them, on those difficult things. So, there are 6 factors that I talk about as making up resilience. And I think the place to start is with one that actually is probably the category of mindset. And this has to do with knowing your why. So, why law enforcement? Why wellness? Why get up in the morning? Why anything really? And I'm sure it's no surprise that we've been having a lot of conversations with officers lately about why law enforcement, but also today what we're going to focus on is why wellness. But the interesting thing, whether it's law enforcement or wellness that you're needing to kind of re-identify your why about, is just recognizing that that may be what you need to do. Some people, many people have said, this job doesn't feel so much like the way I went into it anymore. And I'm struggling with finding my why, because I know why I went into it, but now I'm having trouble finding my purpose in it now. That's a really important job to do. Knowing your purpose, your intention, and your clarity is going to give you a peace of mind and a sense about having a mindset that is strong going forward and can get you through whatever is ahead with some sense of resilience. So just to continue with some definitions here, stress is the disruption of homeostasis. What is homeostasis? Homeostasis is balance. It's when kind of the two sides of a scale are balanced. In our nervous systems, it's when the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system are equally pulling on each other. So one is our rest and digest system, and one is our fight, flight, or freeze system. And so when those are equally pulling and have kind of equal strength, we don't feel stressed. But when we do, it's because the fight or flight system has taken over. The purpose of that stress response system is to return us to homeostasis. So I'm going to ask for some participation here, which I'll try to do a few different times today. It's hard over Zoom. I love the in-person teaching and small group stuff and getting everybody talking, but we'll just have to make do, right? So there is a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, and I love nerdy books like this about trauma, and so I love to share little snippets with you from the research that I do. So imagine that you are a zebra. Answer in the chat box to everybody if you'd like. What are you stressed about if you are a zebra? Somebody said lions, somebody said being in the open. What else? There's about 3 things really that zebras worry about. Getting made into a rug, yes. My stripes not matching my hooves, definitely. Gators, yes. Predators, generally, for sure. Blending in. All right. Anything else related to predators, whether it's gators, not being able to hide? Yeah, food source, absolutely. Starvation is a worry. Predators are a worry. And the last one would be injury. So an injured zebra is probably a pretty worried zebra. So that's exactly it. And that's about all it comes down to, really. So let's say again that you are a zebra. What are you not worried about? How to fly, yes. You're not worried about how to fly. It's not a concern of yours. You have not evolved in the whole scheme of evolution to need to fly. You're not worried about money. That's exactly right. That's just a non-issue. World peace, taxes, absolutely. Being anywhere at a certain time. That's right. So pipelines, yeah. So what you're not worried about is relationships, deadlines, finances. But zebras are also, yeah, they're also not worried about looting, but they're also not worried about predators that aren't currently trying to eat them, kill them and eat them. They're also not worried about injuries that may or may not ever happen. They don't have an awareness to have any anticipatory anxiety. And so this is really the difference. Zebras don't get ulcers, humans do, and police officers definitely do. There are higher rates of heart attacks, of dementia, of all kinds of health ailments, cancer, and PTSD, among others. And the argument is that the reason for this is because of the chronic level of stress. Our stress response system really is built for plenty of stress. And I'll talk more about that. But what it isn't built for is chronic hypervigilance and chronic strain. And so, especially in this last year, if not prior, there is a lot of that happening. And I really worry about the toll that it takes. So, a general population, civilian type person in their lifetime will experience between 1 and 3 traumatic experiences in their life on average. In law enforcement, it's hundreds, if not upwards of 1,000, depending on what city and what area of busy cities police officers work in. So these are some of the trauma exposures that police officers are exposed to. Everything from homicides and suicides to crimes, sex crimes against kids. Investigative work is long-term strain on nervous systems because you carry a caseload. It can feel like you are never off duty. And I think there tends to be a misconception that it's maybe easier than patrol, but in fact, it's harder on the nervous system because of that ongoing carrying of a caseload. You're also having to extend empathy to victims over time and getting to know people who are suffering. And so when you extend compassion for an extended amount of time, it strains our systems as well. Again, we're so connected with our brains to each other's brains that you can start to feel what others feel. Of course, there's OISs, there is crash victims, death notifications. I've had officers say it's got to be the worst thing I do. Having to bring somebody bad news is very draining and something that a lot of people dread. There's, of course, witnessing or assisting victims who are suffering, but especially if there's any aspect of relatability. So if anything about the call or the case that you're working on has an aspect of relatability, be careful because it is likely, much more likely to have a strong stress response reaction from you than otherwise. And that's, of course, because of empathy and the way that our brains are connected. So that call where the kiddo died and he was wearing the same shirt as your kid or your grandkid or whatever that piece is, keep an eye on that. It has a particular weight to it as far as that stack of stressors can go for you. So back to the stress response system, I explained why we have the stress response system. It's there so that when it turns on, it can return your system to homeostasis. So when the stress response system turns on, it's a fight, flight, or freeze system in our nervous system. So whenever I'm talking about mental health here, I'm talking about brain health. And because our brain is housed in this, thick skull, it's sort of stuck in there in the dark all the time. Our eyes are connected to our brain, so they are open to the world. They're the only sensory organ we have that's actually directly connected to the world. But otherwise, our brain is kind of stuck in there. But it does have the spinal cord, and the entire nervous system filters down through our whole body and also spans out in the form of our nerves. So our whole system, our organs, every cell in our body, every process that runs is run by the command center of our brain. And so it's the most important, of course, organ in our body. And so this is really what we're talking about today when we talk about stress and trauma and resilience, is our nervous system and the health of our brain and nervous system. So the fight, flight, and freeze response turns on, just like when the zebra needs to run because the lion or the gator is trying to attack. It does that in order to keep us alive and well. That's the main point of it. So what we're not built for is the expectation of stress. That can be toxic to us. We are not good at dealing with the anticipatory defenses that we have. Our brains are really complex. They take a long time to develop compared to other animals and mammals. They're very, very similar in some ways, but also very complex in others. And so they take many years to develop. And so it matters a lot how you are wired in this way, and also the way that you were sort of taught to handle stress. So we are really built for anything that just temporarily knocks our system out of balance. We're not so well built for things that chronically knock our system out of balance. That will weigh on us and essentially can shorten our lifespans. So again, let's go to the chat box. If you could put in the chat box, and maybe just to me only, if you'd like, I'm wondering if you can give a couple different numbers here. So if you could tell me which one it relates to, and feel free to do this in kind of a broad sense. First of all, regarding wellness at your agency and specifically. So in society as a whole, we all have an approach to wellness. We're not great at it, honestly, in this country compared to others. We are less healthy overall. In law enforcement, there's a general sense about wellness, which thankfully is really starting to turn towards the benefit of police officers and recognizing the need for wellness. And then at your particular agency, there is one as well. So if 10 is like the best you can ever imagine the culture being regarding wellness at your agency, and 0 is the worst you can imagine or could ever be, then where do you fall? Probably somewhere within that, if you don't mind sharing. So I've had some people say 7, 3, 4, 7. So it looks like 7. And this is really common. I do this course a lot. And I hear this as well. Somebody just said, I think we talk like it's very high, like an 8, but in reality, it's probably a 2. And so it can be also hard. Someone said 3, 5. I think it can also be hard to guess at this. I see more 5s coming in because there can be pockets of within a culture where there may be a group who is very opposed to wellness initiatives and self-care and all of these things. And then maybe the majority, though, is interested and open, wanting to learn, or even very much practicing, which gives a strong culture of wellness. All right, so let's do another chat, and feel free to send this one to everybody. You can choose where your input goes to, as far as just me or everyone. So if you choose everyone and you don't mind adding in here, what areas do you personally need to work on regarding wellness? And so if, before we even get into what are the areas of wellness, what do you already identify as something that you need? Somebody mentioned physical health, and that they can feel the toll that the last year took on them. What else? What areas of wellness? Somebody said we're making progress, we're getting there, maybe about a 5 to 7 now as a whole. Somebody said more exercise, more time off with family. All right, any other input? Somebody said physical health overall, better sleep. Absolutely. We're going to spend a lot of time on sleep today. And I'll show you a video as well, which will hopefully fill you in on the importance of it. Somebody mentioned that they are needing to work on trying to remember why they started this career. It sounds like one of those pieces of needing to kind of revamp your sense of purpose and clarity about it. Someone else says nutrition, being able to work out well on duty would be great. I love it when that's a real possibility. Someone said sleep, eating better. Somebody wants to ask more about how their partners are doing and think about if they need to be checked on. And then someone else mentioned healthy methods of coping with trauma. We will be talking about some of that today as well. Somebody mentioned needing to make the job more desirable for those in the business and those that need to be called to this job. Isn't that so true? Somebody mentioned that they have forgotten their why. So that is a perfect place to start. If you are wanting to kind of put some time and focus on this area, just like you said, that's a great place to begin with. If you don't have that set, the rest of it is not going to take hold, no matter how much energy you put into it. All right. And then what are everybody's motivations to focus on wellness? So today in particular, we're talking about wellness. Essentially, I'm asking, what is your why? Why has to do with motivation. So why care about wellness? Why choose to be here today? Maybe you just needed the credits, or maybe you chose this one in particular because we're focusing on officer wellness. I hope that it gives you a little bit of an infusion of information, education, of attention for yourself, better understanding, some ideas. It looks like a couple people have said they are motivated by family, by their kid, family and friends. Absolutely. This is usually the motivation, where the motivation comes from, is others. Another person said family. So somebody said Peter Suk motivates me. I don't know who that is, but I will have to figure that out. All right. Any other motivations, which is about your why, essentially? And it sounds like some people need to figure out the why for wellness. Family, wife, kids, and the officers that I supervise. I want the best for them and their families. Someone else is motivated by what they're looking forward to in retirement. They're motivated by the pension and deferred comp that they have worked hard for, that all of you work hard for, and then you want to enjoy it, and you want to be around to enjoy it. So I know nationally the expected lifespan for law enforcement is really sadly young. It isn't quite as bad in Minnesota, thankfully, but it is very young, much younger than the average for the general population. Okay, thank you for your input. That gives a little bit of ability to participate, have some audience participation. I'm going to cover a couple more things here before we take our first break, which will be in about 10 or 15 minutes. And I want to just step back a little bit, because I know that everyone who takes these classes are, just blended like this. One of my courses will be specifically for those in their first 5 years of law enforcement, but today I'm sure we've got people from across the span of this timeline here. So can somebody share in the chat if you have less than 5 years and how long you've been on? And then also, if you have more than 20 years or more than 15 even, how many years have you been on? I'm trying to get a sense of the range here. Somebody mentioned 13 years, somebody mentioned 6 months. 6 years, 20, 1.5 years. Okay, 5. So we're 18 years, 19 years. So we're really all over the board, which is perfect for this exact slide here. So tell me what you think of this. This is a way that Sergeant Barnes broke down kind of the general career timeline for law enforcement. So in the first 0 to 5 years, he speaks to different things about how you tend to feel about law enforcement: idealistic, proud, also naive, you just don't know what you don't know yet, full of positive energy, physically fit, hungry for action. Some people, and I've certainly heard this, say that they couldn't believe they used to not be able to believe that they get paid to do this. really wanting to help others and enjoying the excitement of it, really. And then 5 to 15 years tends to be another kind of segment of the work. And we see this play out also very distinctly in our practice as far as providing mental health care to police. So 5 to 15 years, you're really becoming highly skilled. Maybe you're a field training officer or a use of force or firearm instructor. There's also certainly some cynicism that can start to set in. And I really think of that 4 to 5 year mark as being where someone needs to probably choose if they're going to very intentionally not become cynical, if there are others who are, or if maybe kind of the drift of law enforcement and the way that it can just sort of take you is going to set in. So you can be less trusting. You've seen plenty of violence, and by about 5 years, you've probably been in a situation where you maybe could have used deadly force. And so there is definitely a change in the way the brain and the nervous system can start to operate when this amount of time has gone by, given what a police officer will experience in those years. The 15 to 30 year mark is the second half of a career and nearing the end of the career. So you're very skilled by this point. You can read people, you can apply this experience to situations. You're often very specialized potentially, or have worked in many different areas. You've maybe become a formal leader, or potentially are an informal leader. And then also, as Sergeant Barnes says, many people have some personal or career baggage at this point. Life happens. I would say certainly by about the 30s, people have been through some really difficult things personally, in addition to professionally. Some people are retired on duty and just kind of let the time tick because they are feeling checked out. It's taken a toll, the stress and the chronic nature of it. And some can tell you their retirement date, even have one of those countdown timers. You can kind of see here how it really matters what point you're at in your career related to how much stress has stacked up, and how you're feeling generally. The way things have potentially either taken a toll, you may have found yourself kind of having drifted off course. If you sort of let the stress of the profession take you that way, you can end up in the weeds. Or potentially there are many who made sure that they had a sail or a motor and a steering wheel on that boat, and they didn't just let the drift take them into the weeds. They chose the path that they're going to take. So here are risks to mental health for law enforcement. This is the last piece that we'll do before we take a quick break here for the first hour. So there are many parallels to military, but there are also some differences. And so I would just like to propose that one of the main differences between law enforcement and military, as far as how the nervous system and brain gets affected, is that you are going to work and exposing your system to dangerous situations very close to home. So potentially in your backyard, in the city you live in, somewhere near where you live, driving distance. You go not very far away, go do that job, need to be in that mode, kind of street work mode. And then you go home, and that happens within 24-hour periods. And so we'll talk more about that. There's also a separate kind of operating mode needed, like within the four walls of your agency, but then another one needed at home. And so that's a lot of shifting gears within one day. And that can be hard to do. And over time, it can become harder and harder to do for good reasons as far as brain science goes, which I will get more into. Another risk to mental health for law enforcement is related to suicidal ideation. In Minnesota specifically, a law enforcement officer is more than 4 times as likely to die from suicide than from any on-duty death. And so this is a real motivating factor, both for us in our programming, to really focus on suicide prevention and make sure that nobody has to feel trapped. Everyone, really everybody in the state who works in law enforcement should have someone to reach out to should they ever need it. Feeling thoughts of suicide, having suicide ideation is unfortunately common. There's statistics that say 25% of police will at some time in their career have suicidal ideation. And the reason that it happens is because when our brains are under a huge amount of distress, our brain will just naturally try to problem solve. So our brains will try to come up with a solution for the huge amount of weight, emotional load that it's carrying. And, it's kind of a natural thing that pops up. But if it takes any form of intention or plan, that's of course when it becomes more dangerous. So I will talk much more about suicide today, what to watch for, how to watch for signs in each other, and then certainly anybody who is having suicidal ideation should be connected with a professional. Shift work, lack of sleep, these all tax our systems. Anybody who is working on a sleep deprivation is kind of running in the red and at risk of burning out. There are secondary effects of trauma exposure, such as strain on relationships. Alcohol abuse is a risk. There are commonly signs of anxiety and depression. And then I would also just make sure to mention and explain the cultural norms within law enforcement that really do create risks to mental health overall. One of them being just stigma towards mental health care. Stigma can be what keeps somebody from getting the help that they need. And thankfully, the overall cultural attitude towards mental health care is changing. People are starting to understand that it's just brain health we're talking about. In law enforcement specifically, 99.999% of what we are assisting with is stress symptoms. So we are not seeing severe and persistent mental illness by any means. And even when we see anxiety and depression, it's almost always an effect of a stress response. So anxiety and depression are most recognizable, but often they are just a portion of actually what's a stress response that's been initiated and has kind of stacked up. The last piece is compartmentalizing. This is something that gets taught and practiced and really has to be built into you as a law enforcement officer. You've got to be able to compartmentalize because you sometimes have to go call to call. And it isn't necessarily very acceptable to need to process how you feel while you're at work. It's becoming more so, thankfully. I think that peer support programs are helping with that. There's a lot of good change happening in that regard. But if you are compartmentalizing, you need to understand that you are putting things into a compartment, and that compartment only has a certain size to it. And so it will work until it doesn't work anymore because that compartment has filled up. And I'll talk more about this in a little bit. But first, let's take our first break. Let's do 5 minutes just to get up, stretch, use the restroom, get a drink of water, whatever you need to do. Let's come back at 1:55. All right, let's continue on here. Please do pipe in with any questions as we go along. I'm continuing to set up kind of the explanation of the stress response system in relation to law enforcement specifically. So as I mentioned, the frequency of trauma exposure for law enforcement is a really important factor to keep in mind. I always like to say that really it's a given that you're all very mentally strong. So just like I said, this is not a matter of like mental illness setting in or any kind of severe and persistent uh, mental health disorders or diseases. We're really just talking about the stress response that's so common for law enforcement because of the frequency of trauma exposure. So what I will explain trauma and stress, I'll give you some definitions on that. But I first wanted to just mention this idea of a stacking effect. So this is really how it works for law enforcement. There's so much to do with the frequency and the volume. So how close together stressful experiences happen is also very important. And we've seen this in particular this past year. The stacking effect has just kind of been on hyperdrive, unfortunately. And so, for instance, you know, in a regular year, an agency who has maybe on the same shift multiple homicides or suicides happen in a short amount of time, that's something to keep an eye on. It's going to have a bigger effect on officers than that same number happening over the course of a few years. So these are all things to be aware of, and it has to do with how long our system has um, to allow for recovery between periods of intensity. So I mentioned the idea of compartmentalizing. I know that you oftentimes have to go from one call to the next and you don't have time to really process what you just experienced. You kind of have to just bucket it and move on. And so if, say on day one, your container was empty, the idea is to think about where it has potentially stacked up today. And the way that it stacks up is when those experiences are left unprocessed. And I will explain what I mean by that. But when your normal course of processing, such as what happens during REM sleep, what happens when you're exercising, what happens when you feel supported and connected, and like those who should be there for you are there for you, oftentimes what you experience kind of moves through you, integrates into you, you take lessons from it, and you move forward. But unprocessed stress is what stacks up. And so it's kind of like this. I'm going to say a very redundant thing when I read the title of this slide and say to you that feelings are meant to be felt. So it probably seems very obvious, but it's sort of like a river. Our system is like a river. Water is meant to just pass through. What happens is when it's not allowed to, when feelings aren't allowed to be felt, and water can't just pass through in this metaphor, you can end up feeling like there's a logjam and or a flood. And the way that that happens is you can start to feel like your cup is full or it's even overflowing. And so that buildup of negative emotions that were never processed can lead to all kinds of problems, which we'll talk about today, but are also listed here. For some people, it shows up as physical pain. It can also show up as numbness. Some people will, and I think law enforcement really can encourage this in people who tend to kind of build a wall because they don't want to feel that negative stuff. The problem with numbness is it's actually really dangerous. It's a form of PTSD. And what happens is if you're going to put a lid on how bad you can feel from the bottom, you're also going to put a cap on how good you can feel. So people end up having a very restricted range of emotion, usually in a very low mood type way. It's also not allowing someone to feel whatever is there and needs to be processed. And so people can sometimes stay numb to the point of even feeling disassociation, which is one aspect of post-traumatic stress. So you can probably see here what some of the other ways that this can play out as, and I will also give you a list. But essentially what's happening is if you imagine this container filling up over time, you are also decreasing your window of stress tolerance. So the space between wherever your cup is filled to and the top is your window of stress tolerance. And the more your container is filled, the less room you have for the stress that you know is coming up next. It's a given in your line of work. So you really need this window of stress tolerance to be as big as it can be. It gets harder to keep it big as time goes on, as we age, as we wear down, sleep deprivation, all of these things. Everything you do is either going to help or hinder your window of stress tolerance, and we'll talk more about that. Another metaphor or way to think of this phenomenon is kind of like if you pack away your feelings, you end up with baggage. So if you can just feel and even just acknowledge something that you're feeling, it will often pass and be temporary. Our mood is more stable. A mood is just kind of how you generally feel. Feelings are meant to be temporary. They're meant to come and go. And so what you don't want is the big stack of baggage. So let's talk about stress and trauma. So stress, trauma is stress, but stress is not necessarily trauma. So what is the difference here? So stress is something that our systems are really built for. We are built for mild and moderate amounts of stress. We actually need it to be healthy. There are some comforts built into our lives, especially more recently with more and more technology that aren't actually very good for our systems because we need some amounts of stress. We don't ever have to walk somewhere to get what we need, which would be healthy for us. It would be healthier if walking and exercise and food that we grow locally, if all of that was built into our lives, we would essentially function better because of what our bodies need. So we work out on purpose to put some stress and strain on our body because it's healthy. So some of us, and by that I mean you, are better equipped for stress than others. Like I said, you're all mentally strong and you have a much higher capacity for stress. You're even built for very intense periods of stress, as long as they're followed by enough down regulation. So what causes something that's stressful to become traumatic is essentially when the demands on your system exceed the available resources. When that container is already full and there isn't the room to take on that added stress, that's when you're going to feel trauma. So what causes something to be traumatic versus just stressful is twofold: a sense of powerlessness and a sense of abandonment, one or both of these. So powerlessness is helplessness, and this is often it will show up as a feeling of guilt. So if you feel guilty, like I should have done more, I could have done more, and you're just sort of like spinning on an incident and feeling like, maybe you're Monday morning quarterbacking yourself, that is a sense of helplessness. It's happening because there truly was an aspect of helplessness. As police, you are all highly trained to control situations, to get control, to keep control, to have it, and to predict and be ready to get it and be a step ahead. And so when you end up feeling like you didn't have it, it can often be traumatic. And it can be and oddly, it almost seems backward. You're all very mentally strong, but because you're so trained for that and it's so built into you, it can actually be hard to accept the helplessness, more so than in the general population, because you are trained to feel like you could have or should have had more control. The other piece is abandonment. So this is feeling like someone who should have been there for you didn't have your back. It also can be feeling like you should have been there for someone and you weren't. And so I certainly have seen this play out many times. Helplessness is much more common, but abandonment absolutely comes into play on the streets, in cases, and kind of that dynamic within the four walls of your agency. Any questions so far? Just jump in here in the chat. I'm going to open it up and try to keep an eye on it here. I have terrible allergies, so I apologize. It's probably a little harder to hear me today. So I wanted to talk again about this relationship of our stress response system and performance, and really when it becomes toxic. So what you can see here on the left is increasing performance levels. On the bottom here is levels of stress from calm all the way to distressed. And really it's in the middle here where we perform optimally. So when we have no stress on us and we're very calm, we may even be bored. As excitement builds, we can then feel energized, focused, and challenged and perform at our best. So best case, this is where you're at. When you're at work, when you are engaged with your loved ones outside of work as well and your friends. But it can then go too far when stress increases beyond a certain point, and that's when people can feel fatigued, exhausted, and burned out. So this is just another way, like another perspective of looking at stress and how really it's good for us as long as it isn't the toxic type. So I want to talk a little bit here about the brain science of stress and of resilience. So I've got here the sentence says your brain is not for thinking. And I have this. This is from a book called 7.5 Lessons About the Brain by Lisa Feldman Barrett. She is an even bigger nerd than me, and I've really enjoyed reading her books. And so giving you snippets of these hopefully is helpful to you. So what is the purpose of the brain if it isn't for thinking? And just put into the chat box here, what is the purpose of our brain if it isn't for thinking? It's kind of twofold. It's actually more like one thing with an aspect to it, but what are your ideas from anybody here? Self-preservation, yeah. Ultimately, it's about survival, right? So I'll break that down into a couple different things. The first one is the purpose of our brain is to manage our body budget. Related to self-preservation, exactly as Jeremiah said, it is about both the immediate survival and self-preservation and the long-term survival. So we, unlike zebras who just live in the moment, and like my dog Charlie, just totally present, directly experiencing every single moment. It's amazing, and I'm jealous. But unlike that, we also look out ahead. We plan for the future. We review the past and we learn from it, but we also look out ahead and plan. And so we are always managing our body's budget. We have a bank account essentially, and we're always either depositing or withdrawing. And so when we deposit, we gain more capacity for strain and intensity. And when we withdraw, we lose it. And so our brain is constantly keeping track of this. It's also constantly predicting. So it's using the past experiences that we've had, and it's using the current sensory input that we're getting, and it's trying to predict for us what is going to happen next. Right now, sitting in this office, this is our Bloomington office, I can see maybe a car crash happening outside, but I also know sensory wise that that's happening far away from me. There's nothing I can do about it, and I'm not going to be hurt from that car crash. So my brain just predicted, like, I'm fine. They're not, but I am. So our brain is literally constantly doing predictions on every level regarding every cellular working of our body. It's an incredibly complex system. And it's also why sleep is so important, is that we need to do all the repairing that's needed at night to catch up from the work that our brain did during the day, and preparing us for the next wake cycle when it's going to do all this work all over again. So one issue that we have is our brain is so heavy on the prediction side. It weighs so heavily the past experiences that we've had that you will start to understand why post-traumatic stress disorder happens. So I'll get more into that in a bit here. But as far as this body budget, So we are all about energy efficiency. Every single resource that our body uses, like glucose, oxygen, water, salt, everything else is either earned or spent. And so when you sleep, you're making a deposit. When you take a drink of water, you're making a deposit. When you run a sprint, you just made a withdrawal in some way, but you also maybe have a benefit because of the body then needing to do some repair for putting that strain on it. So everything has some kind of cost benefit. Everything is an economic choice, and your brain is always telling you when you should be spending and when you should be saving. When you are sick and you feel tired, that's your body telling you rest. I need the energy to kick this bug I'm fighting. So just stop overdoing it, lay down, rest, and I will be able to get better, and then we will balance our budget again. When we're born, we are completely helpless. We rely completely on our caregivers. We have no ability to regulate our own body budget. And so we had to have somebody do it for us. We do it for our kids until they are able to do it for themselves. So later on, we'll talk about, in the second 4 hours, we'll talk about what happens when that isn't done for kids, the way that mental illness can play out. And it can be very predicted even based on caregiving that happens as kids. But we eventually learn how to regulate our own body, hopefully. You have a profession, which if you allow it to, it will make more withdrawals from you than deposits, and you can find yourself in the red. So our brain is also for predicting, and prediction beats reaction. So this is why all the training that you do is so important as far as the way that our brain works. When you have enough training, you're able to predict what is about to happen so that you can act fast enough to make a strong guess, essentially, about what is going to happen next. The book 7.5 Lessons on the Brain is actually proposing, and this is like research as of 2020, so just last year, it's actually predicting, our brain is predicting things that haven't happened yet with incomplete information, but it's predicting based on what it has experienced in the past. So that's the incredible power of the training that you get and just how important all that training is. You're able to predict and make choices faster than someone who is simply reacting to the sensory input in front of them. You are steps ahead because of the training you've had, which has allowed your brain to do what it does. So the central mission, like somebody said, it's to keep you alive and well. And the thing that complicates our prediction system is the other brains and bodies that we share the world with. So we are so interconnected to them, and everyone else can cause us to feel differently, to function differently, to have different deposits and withdrawals. And we are all super independent and intertwined in just an inextricable way, really. So I'm going to talk here a little bit about PTSD. I don't like the name PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It is post-traumatic stress. It's stress that happens post-trauma. But I don't like the word disorder. There is some disordered thinking that can go along with it, but that's not primary. What primarily is happening is you're having really an intelligent response to what your brain has learned to predict. And so the actual injury of post-traumatic stress is that your brain has become so wired to predict that more bad things are going to happen or that they are still happening that it can't accurately reflect reality. So there's a lot of ways we could get into this much more deeply, but I'll just say that there are signs of this happening as subclinical symptoms before somebody actually meets criteria for a diagnosis. Once somebody does, there is then mild, moderate, and severe forms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So the subclinical symptoms are, I think, have traditionally been thought of as, well, we're all just like that. That's just being a cop. But we now know that's not true. We got to keep an eye on these. Just 1 second here. I'm going to step away for just 1 second. Okay, I didn't want to blow my nose in front of you. You can laugh at me. Um, so at this point here where the arrow is, just for context, that's where somebody would meet criteria. We don't have to diagnose in our practice. We provide employer paid sessions, so we're not billing insurance. When you bill insurance, you have to diagnose. You have to justify the reason for the medical cost with a medical diagnosis. But we don't have to do that because we're billing employers directly in a confidential way. So it's sort of irrelevant, but also the other piece about it is sometimes or very often, even if somebody comes to us technically meeting criteria for a diagnosis, if they come to us early enough on, or even if they have very severe PTSD, but they've been working with us for a while, you may not meet criteria anymore. So it's a little bit of an ambiguous thing and there isn't a ton of value to it. Sometimes people want to know. I feel out of control. I know I'm safe, but I'm having panic attacks. What's happening to me? And we can run through and actually put that label on if it's going to help somebody for sure. And there are scenarios where people ask us to, but because we know that it helps increase access to care, we don't have to diagnose. And any therapist you work with who does these employer paid sessions shouldn't have to either. So I will run through what the diagnostic criteria is just so that you have the knowledge for yourself. But the most important thing here I wanted to note is these subclinical symptoms. You can have a few symptoms of post-traumatic stress and be able to recognize in yourself that stress has stacked up and that your brain may be at this point where an actual injury can happen. You can actually see this injury on scans, and I'll talk about how it ends up looking in the brain. But the other thing to be aware of is when somebody finds themselves really high on this spectrum, like the 7 to 8 range in the more severe category, that's when we often see someone saying that they are unable to function the way they need to at work and or very often are having thoughts of suicide. And that is because of this extreme level of distress that a person will feel when they are that high on the spectrum. These are the 4 diagnostic clusters related to PTSD. And so re-experiencing, avoidance, negative cognitions and mood, and arousal and reactivity. This is how all of the symptoms get kind of broken down in these 4 areas. Re-experiencing shows up as either flashbacks, nightmares, or even just kind of intrusive thoughts or images about scenarios you've been in that had a life or death kind of aspect. They can get stuck there in kind of a vivid way because they have an emotional load to them that wasn't processed, either because you were so stressed from the experience that you didn't sleep well, or that the experience overwhelmed your system. It needed more from you than you had to give, sometimes just unavoidably, or you already had so much stacked up that there just wasn't room for what it needed from you. Avoidance symptoms can be anything from just feeling like I hate that type of call. I don't like going to those calls to I had a client who would just showing up into the parking lot at work, he would vomit because his nervous system was just screaming at him, do not walk in that door. The things that happen when you walk in that door, we can't handle anymore. And I'm telling you, I'm predicting for you, we've learned that it's not safe to go in there. And so that would be a very extreme example of an avoidance symptom for someone who had very severe PTSD. Negative cognitions and mood. This has to do with either depression or anxiety symptoms or negative thoughts about oneself that I'm a failure, I must be weak, I can't believe I can't handle this stuff anymore, what's wrong with me, those kinds of things. And then the last one is arousal and reactivity. This would be when your nervous system is telling you that something is not safe when logically you know that you're safe. So if you feel hypervigilant outside of work and you can't turn off that hypervigilance, you may be having this 4th cluster symptom going on. And so being able to calm your system down, it can become something that you need to practice multiple times a day on a daily basis once you have, once you're high enough on that spectrum of post-traumatic stress. These are some of the symptoms to watch for. Not going to read through all of them, but I'll stay on this slide long enough. Maybe take a picture of it. I always say as well, check with your loved ones. Ask them, have you noticed any of these in me? Because I can tell you more often than not, because in your profession you are so commonly taught to be sort of numb to how you feel. That's one of the risks, is that people tend to not notice until there's a lot of these going on. And people will say, I'm fine. And part of that is because you have a strong mindset. I hear all the time, I don't want to make it seem like I think I'm a victim. That's absolutely not it at all. In fact, you can take that too far and really just deny acknowledging how you're actually doing and the effect that stress can take on you. You are human after all. I say that a lot. Maybe there's some sort of ridiculous misconception that you're supposed to be both, a sweet, cuddly puppy and a robot. But at the end of the day, you're all still human, and stress can take its toll and stack up and start to show these sorts of symptoms. So the one that I will point out is numb, which I've mentioned a few times. But when you think about the difference between numb and neutral, it's good to, if you can feel neutral towards really difficult stuff that you have to see and do. When you feel numb towards it, you may also notice yourself starting to feel numb or detached from loved ones. And they are sometimes the ones who will tell you, hey, you feel really distant lately. I feel like I can't connect with you like I used to. Are you ever going to come back? All right, so just to go back, we're going to follow up here with this slide. I have it here again because I just want to point out two of the areas that are affected in the brain. Physically, the structure of the brain by post-traumatic stress. So the amygdala and the hippocampus, you can see it's no coincidence that they are right next to each other and they are both affected. So the amygdala is, in just very broad terms, kind of the fear center of the brain. It isn't actually the fear center. And if you even don't have an amygdala, you can still feel fear. So don't take that as just a broad sweeping statement, but it certainly has to do with fear. And when you have PTSD, the amygdala gets enlarged. The hippocampus has to do with memory. And so when somebody has PTSD, the hippocampus shrinks. There are some medications and practices, non-medication practices, that can be done to help increase the size of the hippocampus and shrink or calm the amygdala. And that is really what trauma treatment is about. Physically, that's what we're trying to get at in the brain. The hippocampus has to do with memory, and memory gets affected with stress because your brain becomes less able to file away memories. Another metaphor, like every other sentence I use is a metaphor. They aren't perfect, but they help describe what I'm trying to explain. So your brain is like a filing cabinet. While you are asleep and getting your REM cycles, hopefully, and getting at least 6.5 hours of sleep, your brain is going to be processing what it experienced and filing away memories. When it's not able to do this because because you're not sleeping, or because there is such a stress response tied to the memory, it won't get filed away properly. That's why those images stick around, or that's why people have flashbacks or nightmares. It's the brain trying to process, it's replaying it. It's been flagged as a life or death scenario to watch out for, and it's asking you, hey, keep an eye on this. I've learned from this that you need to predict that more bad things are going to happen. Any questions at this point? Any questions on stress or trauma, the nervous system, any of the pieces I've described so far? All right, I will move on then. We're going to talk next about suicidal ideation. After that, we will go into the 6 different resilience factors And I first, though, want to start this or finish this first portion on stress and trauma by explaining a little more about suicidal ideation, how it happens, why it happens, and what to watch for in yourself and each other. I did have a question come through here, so um, let me see. We've got, why do some get PTSD and others may go an entire career and feel fine? There maybe is some type of inoculation strategy that prepares some better than others, genetics, environment. If we knew what helped us inoculate against this, it would help us perhaps choose our careers more wisely or allow agencies to choose candidates better suited for this work. Such a fantastic question. So trauma is not specific to an event, it is specific to an individual. So you can have 10 people at the same awful, horrible scenario, but only a portion will have a strong post-traumatic stress response. A portion may feel neutral about it, and a portion may have an acute response, which then fades pretty quickly. It is entirely based on the unique individual involved. So childhood sets the stage to begin with. Actually, our genetics set the stage to begin with. Some people are set up genetically for resilience, just like we can be set up genetically for different diseases or illnesses, we can also be set up for resilience. Then, once you're born, the way that you're cared for and the environment your brain gets developed in has a big role in how resilient you're going to be. And then, once your brain is developed in your mid to upper 20s, takes that long for our brains to develop, then it matters a lot what you do to take care of your resilience. So I'll cover the 6 factors, which are sleep and non-sleep, deep rest. Second factor is how much are you exercising, what is your nutrition like, and what is your hydration like. Third factor is support. How supported is a person? How connected are they at home? And how supported do they feel at work? The next factor is living a balanced life. Do you have enough time outside of work where you aren't thinking about the past or the future and you're engaged in things that you enjoy doing? And then the other one is mindset. So what kind of mindset do you have going into your workday? How have you chose to look at things? What perspective do you have on them is also going to play a role in how resilient you are. And then also, how big of a stack of stress do you already have? And the bigger the stack you already have going into any particular scene or call or case, um, the more at risk you are that it's going to potentially overload your system and need more from you than you have the capacity to give to process it. The last piece is access to professional care. So anybody who doesn't have their own personal stigma towards mental health care and has kind of kept up on their resilience factors with a professional who, you know, is kind of your accountability maybe, or has helped you process trauma so that that stack isn't so high, that's going to be another piece as well. So it's a really complicated question. That's probably the shortest but still kind of complete answer I can give. So hopefully that helps. And please, and for anybody, ask me to expand as we go through this, because I'll go into more of all of that. All right, so suicidal ideation. As I mentioned before, the rates of suicide for law enforcement are unacceptably high. One officer lost to suicide ever is too many, to be quite frank. So this is really a passion of ours at my practice. As I said too, it's a common response. So suicidal ideation is a common response to significant psychological distress. Alcohol greatly increases the risk of suicide. The reason is because when we drink, we're more impulsive. We have less impulse control. And so something that maybe we wouldn't have done when we hadn't been drinking can happen. There is also, of course, easy access to firearms for law enforcement. So as far as first responders go, fire and EMS have higher rates, much higher rates of suicide attempts, but law enforcement overall have the highest rates of suicide completion because of access to firearms. These are the 5 risk factors specific to law enforcement for suicide. The stress that's going on within an organization is a factor. Shift work is a factor because of the strain of switching sleep schedules and the effect on friendships, on our circadian rhythms, which I wish I could get more into today, but I will a little bit when we talk about sleep. Relationship problems are a risk factor. I always want to know how supported someone is feeling or if they are having strain in their relationships. I worry much more about someone who is feeling suicidal who doesn't have good support at home than I do someone who has good support at home. And critical incident trauma is, of course, there, it's a given, and then alcohol use. So these are kind of the 5 things that can make up kind of that perfect storm. I'm going to play a video for you here. Please, I'm going to watch the chat box and please tell me if you can't see it or hear it. I may have to send you a link to watch it in the chat box if it doesn't work this way, but I embedded it here, so I'm hoping that it works just fine. So let's give it a try. This is a video about the challenges of being a soldier in the military in relation to suicide, but there is a lot of crossover, I believe, with law enforcement, and I want you to see this because I think it gets at the same reason, one of the really important reasons why suicide happens in law enforcement.
There's no audio.
There's no audio? Okay. I had this happen another time. So what I will do is send you all a link in the chat box that you can watch on your own device. Sorry about that. I have it pulled up here just because I knew this might happen. So just a moment. Okay, I just sent it. I'm going to play it here as well. And then we'll come back. And once you're back, if you could turn your camera on so that I know you're back, that'll be how I know we can keep going. And please do jot down a couple of things that stand out to you about the video, and we'll share those in the chat afterwards. the best. Can I put a band-aid on that arm? All right, it looks like people are starting to come back. Awesome. So could everybody start to put into, somebody said that sure was uplifting. I know, right? Can everybody put into the chat something that stood out to you about the video? Somebody says trouble asking for help. Isn't that so true? The helpers tend to have trouble asking for help. And that goes for my profession as well. I don't know if Katie was there, but I was at a trauma conference, an ART trauma conference a couple years ago, and one of the speakers was talking about self-care in, for trauma therapists, and she said, raise your hands. There's about 100 people in the room, 100 trauma therapists in the room. Raise your hands. How many of you get your own mental health care, get your own, have your own outlet from another mental health professional to take care of yourself? And 5 of us raised our hands. And I thought, oh man, that's not a good sign. Somebody said molded to disregard empathy. The idea of reprogramming when they're done with their service. Yeah, feeling there are consequences for getting help, which is still a problem, of course, we're trying to overcome now in Minnesota for law enforcement. The need to share our pain and feelings. Finding it difficult to live, not necessarily wanting to die, but finding it difficult to find a reason to live. That stood out to somebody. I also noticed how he said every night when that soldier went to sleep, he would see the face of that little boy. So that really speaks to what I explained about the brain science of trauma, how we will store vivid images that will turn into intrusive thoughts. It's essentially a replaying of a portion of that scene that has stuck for him because it has an emotional load to it, a stress response load to it. I'll then text you in a bit here before we're done about eye movement therapy and the type of trauma therapy that we do at my practice, and how it makes those images less vivid so that our brain has less of an emotional load. I thought it was also so interesting how he explained, he used the word emotional fortresses. So I use the word numb a lot, emotional numbness. But the emotional fortresses that you learn to build, that you need to be able to have to some degree, but then need to be able to put down when you go home, when you are trying to connect with your peers, when you want to be connected and engaged with your family. So someone else mentioned constantly feeling the need, just a second here, constantly feeling the need to be tough. And then someone said the example of the first Marine getting put into a situation to solve that they did not choose to go to or want to be present at applies. Some are great outcomes, some are terrible, but you never get to choose. It's true, you don't get to choose what you get called to go do. And once you're there, you have to do what is called upon you to do. You can be forced into situations that you aren't choosing, and that is such a good point. So I liked also how he said the question isn't, what is your trauma or who did you kill, but more so, how did you heal? Do you have compassion fatigue? Or can you still feel empathy, at least at home, for your loved ones? The main idea here is you deserve to feel, and your ability to feel happy is based on your ability to regulate your body's budget, essentially. So the unhappiest people have made way too many withdrawals and not enough deposits. And so next we'll get into some of what helps us have deposits or withdrawals. Okay, this is a question here for you to reflect on. I like to do this in my practice sometimes with clients to just kind of get a sense of where someone feels like they're at and where they want to get to. So if on this scale, it's a scaling question, it's a neat idea we use as in the therapy world to get a sense of where somebody's at and help create kind of solution focused ideas. So terrible versus couldn't be better. 0 is terrible, 10 is couldn't be better. I don't know anybody who operates at a 10 all day, every day. That's not realistic, but maybe an 8 is a realistic kind of high functioning quality of life number. Maybe temporarily somebody feels at a 10. If you're always at a 10, please let me know. Maybe somebody who's manic feels consistently at a 10, maybe others as well. But just to give you kind of some perspective here, once you've chosen a number, think about what brings you up to that number from a 0? Why aren't you at a 0? And then the same question goes the other way. What could get you to an 8 or a 10 if you aren't already there? And that might give you a sense of where to go next. These are some ideas. Whatever number you are at, and maybe set a reminder on your phone to check in with yourself about this again in a month or in 6 months or whatever time frame you think makes sense. If you're motivated to make some changes, if you aren't feeling or functioning the way you want to, take into consideration these next 6 things I'm going to talk about related to resilience and see what you think you might do differently. Before we do that though, it's time for a break. So let's do 10 minutes and let's come back at 3:12. All right, hi everybody. Okay, so let's jump in and start focusing on the 6 resilience factors. I'm also hoping to get you out of here a little bit early. So we're going to focus most heavily on sleep, as I said. It is the most important resilience factor. Sleep and non-sleep deep rest are the two that make up this first category. So if you think about the budget idea, the body budget idea of everything either being a deposit or a withdrawal, the most important deposit you can make just on a daily basis in every 24-hour period is sleep and non-sleep deep rest. Exercise, support, having a balanced life, mindset, and professional care are the other two, or are the other 5. So related to sleep, I want to first just explain your sleep cycles, but really the only one I'm going to go into in much depth is REM cycles. And I'm not going to go into a ton of depth at that, but I'm going to show you a video and it will go in a little bit more to understand these. REM cycles are what your brain uses to help process information. As I said, it helps repair your brain from the withdrawals that were made during the day, and then it also prepares it for your next wake cycle. So your REM sleep happens as part of each 90-minute sleep cycle. So every 90 minutes that you are asleep, you cycle through different stages of sleep, which complete in a 90-minute cycle. So if you take a 90-minute nap, you're getting an entire sleep cycle. If you take a nap that's less than about 25 minutes, you won't ever get into the stages of sleep that can disrupt your next sleep cycle. So it is definitely okay, and it's a good thing to take naps that are about 20 to 25 minutes long. Even 10, 15 minutes, any of that is kind of like pressing the refresh button. So REM cycles happen in those 90 minutes, but you can't just take 90-minute naps all day long, continually being interrupted, and think you're going to get good REM sleep. You have to have continuous sleep. And the reason is because the longer you're asleep, the more REM cycles you're going to get, especially they tend to be loaded on the end of your sleep. So if you have trouble not just falling asleep, but maybe staying asleep, you're likely not getting great REM sleep. If you're very sleep deprived, sometimes your brain will front load it, and right when you fall asleep, it'll drop you into REM sleep. To try to make up for it for a sleep debt. You do have a couple of days to make up a sleep debt. So I've had a lot of people ask, is it bad that I sleep a lot on my first day or two off after a rotation? No, it's not. It's really good. You should try to catch up on a sleep debt when you can, because you only have a couple days to do it. You can't make up for sleep that you lost weeks, months, or years ago. Some people have sleep disturbances or nightmares, and this is good to be aware of because it can tell you that you're having a stress response. Some people aren't feeling great, they're feeling stressed, but they're still sleeping well. They are not having as big of a stress response as someone who isn't sleeping well, in addition to whatever else they're noticing. Some people notice sleep first, and some people notice it along with other symptoms. But anytime someone isn't doing well, they're also not sleeping well. So keep a close eye on sleep. It's kind of the chicken and the egg, and it's a little bit of like a snowball effect. If you're very stressed, it will likely disrupt sleep. If you aren't sleeping, it will likely add to your stress. So it's such a careful thing to keep an eye on. Non-sleep deep rest is just what it sounds like. It's deep rest that you can get without actually being asleep. So your brain can get some deposits and get, like I said, kind of the refresh button pressed by some practices that you can do while you're awake. So you can get really good benefits of rest while you're conscious. I'll talk more about that. Sleep, I want to mention 4 different aspects of sleep. So everybody has a circadian rhythm. I'm sure you've heard of that term. It's a 24-hour cycle that our brain runs on. So what our brain likes more than anything related to sleep is routine. So the best thing that you can do for your sleep is to go to bed at the same time every night. And so that's why it's healthier for you to stay on a night schedule of sleeping during the day rather than flip back and forth. That's easier said than done. There's no awesome solutions if you work night shift. You may need to make those flips because of family obligations. You may need to because you have to get to things that are only open during the day. There's a lot of things that comes up in real life. But ideally, if you work a night shift, you would always go to sleep and wake up at the same time. This is because of your circadian rhythm. There is literally a piece of your brain kind of above the palate in your mouth that kind of sets this clock. The way that this clock gets set is through temperature, light exposure, and food intake. So I'm speaking here to information that Dr. Andrew Huberman gives in his podcast, the Huberman Lab podcast. And he just started it at the beginning of this year. Again, I love this stuff. I'm a huge nerd. But he's got some of his very first episodes, he does go just deep into sleep, and they're fascinating. So I've just kind of boiled it down to some things here for you. If you want to know more about the circadian rhythm, there's a book called The Circadian Code, and it will outline for you the best timing to do all kinds of things to help you lose weight, to sleep better, to feel better, everything you can imagine. It'll kind of tell you, it'll break down for you what makes sense in these ways. So I'm going to mention temperature. So you can use temperature to enhance your sleep and your wakefulness. So your temperature when you are going to be falling asleep will start to drop, and that is what initiates melatonin release. Everybody knows that melatonin is what helps make us tired. You can take it as a supplement. It is a hormone, so be careful. I always say if you need help sleeping because you're on a night shift, or you're maybe switching back to a day shift, or you're switching time zones, take it, but I wouldn't take it long term, like forever, because it is a hormone just like estrogen and testosterone are. So take it as needed. It can help you fall asleep. It doesn't do so much for helping you stay asleep, but if you use a type called Ollie that has L-theanine in it, that can actually help you stay asleep. So I tend to talk about Ollie as a good option to use, especially if you work a night shift. So temperature, you can control some pieces of sleep through temperature. If you before bed take a hot shower or bath. So about an hour before bed, if you heat up your body temperature on purpose, your body will then need to cool itself down, which will help melatonin release. It'll help promote that just naturally. So that's one idea. On the other side, after your sleep cycles, when you wake up, whether it's morning, afternoon, whatever, you can expose yourself to cool or cold water. And that will set your body's timer for knowing that it should start to get tired within about 12 hours. That may sound like torture. You might think I'm crazy for saying that, but you can absolutely take your shower in the morning, but at the end, even just for 30 seconds, turn it cool or cold, so that not so that you're shivering, but so that you need to maybe breathe heavily to kind of fight off a shiver response. It's going to wake you up. It's also a bit of stress inoculation. It's a way to feel more in control because you've just now overcome the first challenge of the day, instead of it just kind of being thrown at you and not knowing when it's going to come up. And so that's just an idea of something that you can do. And if any of you already do that, you should let me know. I see there's something in the chat box, but for some reason I'm not able to open it up at the moment. I will have to figure that out. Light exposure is another one. The thing that turns your brain on for wakefulness is light exposure. So if you make sure to get light exposure outside, outdoors, for about 10 minutes within the first couple of hours of waking up, that's going to help cue your mind to know that it should, again, get tired in about 12 hours. So once light exposure happens, your brain then knows, okay, here's the rhythm. 12 hours from here is when I should start getting tired. On the flip side, You should then also make sure that you aren't getting light exposure before you're trying to fall asleep. So whether that's at night and you can turn off overhead lights, or that's in the morning because you've worked a night shift and you're headed home and the sun is already rising, make sure to put on sunglasses. Glass certainly blocks out some light. It takes 50 times longer to get light intake behind like the glass of a window than to go outside and get it when you need it, but it still affects your brain certainly. So making sure to limit or eliminate light exposure in the morning is important if you are trying to sleep during the day. Even if you're very tired, light exposure is so strong to your brain, it sends such a strong message that you'll get that second wind. Your brain will think, well, we didn't get any sleep, but it's time to wake up. So let's do that and just make do with what we can. And that may be why you're having trouble sleeping during the day if you have to do night shift work. Food intake. So light exposure, I said, is what wakes up the brain. Food intake is what wakes up your organs. So once you ingest anything but water, you are going to initiate the circadian rhythm for your organs. So just like you should be eating something in the morning, maybe with protein to give you energy during the first part of the day at least, you also want to limit food intake prior to a sleep cycle so that your brain can and organs can focus completely on restoring themselves and repairing and not on digesting food. So just some ideas and tips here about sleep that I wanted you to have. I'm going to try to see how I can pull up this chat box. There it is. Okay. The product that I mentioned was Olly, Olly is the brand. It comes in a like a squarish plastic container, and there's Olly for sleep and there's Olly for stress. The stress one has L-theanine and GABA in it, which are both great for calming your brain from kind of spinning and thinking too much. And then the Olly for sleep has melatonin plus L-theanine in it. So something to think about. L-theanine, I will put in the chat box here so that you can use it if you'd like. It's just like an amino acid that already exists in your brain. And Dr. Huberman says he takes it at night. He doesn't use melatonin, but he also doesn't work a night shift. But he does use L-theanine, and I do too. So I will put that in the chat box. I'm also sending out here a link so that you can watch the video on sleep, which I'm going to pull up, and then we will reconvene. So let's do that. There's L-theanine. Olly for sleep is another idea. Again, remember it's a hormone, so don't take it all day, every day for the rest of your life. It could mess with the balance of your testosterone and estrogen, but do use it as needed here and there to help you fall asleep. And then the last one I'm going to mention is called magnesium threonate. This is another one that Dr. Huberman recommends. It will increase the amount of REM cycles that you have when you are sleeping. I have not had any like weird dream effect with magnesium threonate, certainly not with L-theanine. I take those two things before bed every night. And what I've noticed is much more REM sleep. And I'll tell you about the sleep tracker that I use, which is one of the few that accurately tracks sleep. And it seems that my REM cycles are really increasing, and it must be because of the magnesium threonate. So I think it's really working. All right, let's watch the video on sleep and then come back. Once you're back, maybe just put in the messages that you are back. Okay, it looks like most people are back. I'll just give a little bit of time here because I see it. Oh, maybe it's done. Okay. Put in the chat box, please, anything that stood out to you. And while you're doing that, I just wanted to highlight what he said about anchoring your sleep in regularity. I wanted to mention that there is actually something called anchor sleep, which is making sure that even if you're having to flip schedules around, you always have at least 4 hours of sleep where you are always asleep. So maybe that's from 7 a.m. to 11 a.m. That no matter if you sleep beyond that or you've been asleep before that and you wake up at 11, if your brain can at least consistently predict that it will be asleep during the same 4 hours every night, you're going to do much better than if you don't have that. So somebody said he must not work nights or have kids. Very true. And then someone else said, I've definitely said I can sleep when I die. I've used to say that as well. And then this person said, I didn't realize how bad a lack of sleep truly is. It's very true. I mean, it's just for good reason, the most important piece here. So again, easier said than done if you work nights. It can be incredibly hard to sleep well, to make up for your sleep debt within those couple of days, and to stay on top of all of these things. The other thing he mentioned is cool temperature. Making sure that the room you sleep in is cool is really important. And so is blocking out any sensory input. So if you can have sound machine, blackout curtains, make sure that no cat or dog is jumping on your bed, waking you up for that touch input. Having zero sensory input while you're asleep allows your brain to have the least disruption to its sleep cycles. So, all right. Next thing I'm going to jump into here is non-sleep deep rest. And I'm going to minimize the screen over here. Okay, so I just want to briefly cover what I mean by this. So there are some examples I have here. Most people have heard and some even use tactical breathing. And that would be a form of NSDR, non-sleep deep rest. Just simply using your breath to calm your nervous system. The reason it works is because your breath is part of your brainstem area. Your breath gets controlled involuntarily unless you choose to control it. So when you do choose to control it, you then have more control over your the rest of your system, your blood pressure, your heart rate, all of those things that get run kind of automatically, your startle reflex, all that stuff. So you know you can calm yourself down by using your breath. You can also amp yourself up by using your breath. If you take inhales that are deeper than your exhales, you're going to oxygenate your system and you're going to amp yourself up. It also has to do with the amount of space that your heart has based on what your lungs are doing when they put pressure on your heart. So if you do something like 4-7-8 breathing, that's going to be an inhale to 4, a pause to 7, and then an exhale to 8. If you notice, the exhale is twice as long as the inhale because that's the calming part of your breath. You can also imagine what's happening for your heart. That affects how much blood can be pumped, your blood pressure, your heart rate. So there's this whole actual physical piece of what's happening when you use your breath to calm your system. I want to point out the second idea here, which is a double inhale, full exhale. This is the most effective way to downregulate your system as quickly as possible. So if you take an inhale and then inhale again slightly and then fully exhale, you're going to feel like you just had a sigh of relief. That's the effect that it will have on your body. You're basically mimicking a sigh of relief without actually maybe feeling like you could take one because maybe you aren't otherwise feeling relieved or feeling like you can take a sigh. But that's a way to replicate one and to, in just a few breaths, really shift down out of a higher gear and allow your body to recover. So those are just some ideas quick here on non-sleep deep breaths. I want to mention to you this idea of the types of thoughts that we have, because this also has to do with rest and recovery. So our thoughts are broken up into two different categories. One is narrative mode. Narrative mode is the left lane and the right lane. This is when we are either reviewing the past in our mind, kind of narrating a review of the past, or we're planning for the future, looking ahead, anticipating. It can feel like anxiety. If you over review the past, it can feel like depression. If you over anticipate the future, it can feel like anxiety. The narrative mode is our default mode. So that's where we tend to find ourselves. The middle lane, though, represents direct experiencing. So this is like my dog Charlie or my dog Maddie. This is like the zebra. They are just present here right now, alert and focused. A zebra, when it isn't being chased by a gator or a lion, is probably in direct experiencing mode, asleep, taking a nap, chilling out in the shade. And so, best case, you can spend a significant amount of time here, like maybe half of your conscious waking hours in this direct experiencing mode. That's really hard to do when you work in law enforcement because your work requires of you that you be in the right lane and one step ahead, ready to take control of any situation and prepared and predicting all of the different things that could happen. So when you get very wired for that right lane thinking, it can be hard to learn to switch out of it. And for, of course, safety and survival reasons, it can be hard to tell yourself and feel in your body that it's safe to switch out of that mode. But it's important, it's an important piece to do. So for some reason it switched to mute, but it looks like it's okay now. So sorry about that. I thought I had lost you all. That would have been much worse. Okay, so I'm going to talk here a bit about exercise. This is the next most important piece of resilience. And I think I lost my screen sharing. So I'm going to switch back there. Okay. All right, now we're back in business, it looks like. Okay, so these are some of the improvements that you can feel from exercise. It's a close second to sleep as far as resilience goes. So if you ever have to choose between sleep and exercise, it's better to choose sleep. But best case, you can do both. If you haven't been exercising in a while, it's a card you're not playing that you can, and it's going to help you. So at least 30 minutes of exercise at least 3 times a week is what we should all be doing at a minimum. But at the same time, be careful because you can overdo exercise. Typically, exercise is a deposit as far as your body budget goes, but you can do it to such an extreme that it ends up being a withdrawal. So overdoing it certainly isn't good, but as long as you're within a healthy range with it, these are some of the things that it can benefit with. I wanted to tell you about this study. I read the Journal of Police Psychology because I'm a big nerd, and I found this study they did, or that they reported on, and what they did was they looked at physical fitness, mental hardiness, and higher parasympathetic control during stress. And what they found was that Physical fitness and mental hardiness are both linked to the ability to recover and reset from stress conditions. So, maintenance of high physical fitness not only helps complete physically demanding tasks, of course, you're better in shape physically for those, but it also helps you withstand non physical psychological stress where your overall resources are more depleted. So you have your psychological resources and your physical ones. And when you are in good physical shape, you will also be better equipped to deal with physical stressors. This is so great to see because I think we all know it. When you are in better shape physically, you feel better mentally. There's such a strong interconnection is there that there really isn't too much of a difference between our physical health and our mental health. Our brain health is our body health, and vice versa. So this is such a neat thing to see them studying specifically in law enforcement. I'm so happy to see that. Um, Next factor I want to talk about here before we take our last quick break is family life. Family life as a protective factor. So I mentioned support as the overall resilience factor we're talking about here. And within support is both feeling supported at work and feeling connected at home. So if you remember what I said about when we're born and when we're growing up and how much we need others and they help us regulate our own body budgets, the same thing happens into adulthood. So we still need each other to help co regulate. When you are around someone who's very dysregulated, you staying regulated helps them regulate. And so hopefully your family is this for you and you are this for them. It can help counteract the intensity of work life. Um, and you can get feel good hormones from connectedness, just like you do from exercise, that can counteract the effects of epinephrine and adrenaline. So when you have been investing in close family ties, it ends up paying you back in things like keeping your life balanced, giving you a sense of feeling understood and supported no matter what went on at work. You can help preserve the experience of normalcy, like potentially seeing the world kind of through the eyes of those who don't have to see and do what you do every day. It can be harder to relate to those who haven't been there and done that, but there's also value to seeing the world through their eyes because they haven't continually seen the worst of the worst. And so they may actually have a more balanced perspective that you can tap into. This is what I just briefly mentioned earlier about the emotional agility that it takes to move between these areas. So you have such a unique job in that within a 24-hour period, you need to go from operating mode that you use at home. Hopefully you're have your guard down, you're tuned into your kids and your family, in your friends. You have the ability to be more emotionally vulnerable and flexible all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which is street life, where you are um, potentially always about to enter a life or death scenario. You have to be ready to react, to fix, to control the situation, and really hypervigilance is needed here for safety. Somewhere in the middle is nation life. You're an employee, a colleague, a partner. If you use any of these operating modes in any other area, you will notice consequences from it. And so just being aware that there are these different areas you need to move between, I think is important. And then realizing the agility that it takes. So um, I think that as people get more stressed, it can be easier to get stronger in just one aspect of this. Most often, people tend to bring street mode home versus bringing home mode to work. Um, Once in a while, I've seen it happen actually, where people have trouble kind of getting amped up um, to run the race at work, but very more commonly, like just almost always, the issue is bringing work mode home. So one last thing I want to point out about this is that on both ends of this spectrum, there is something that you all have in common. So it's unique that you need to move through these within 24-hour periods, and it can feel like It's almost impossible to do this. The more stressed you get, the more rigid we tend to get as we get more stressed. And what we tend to do is stick to whatever keeps us safer in the moment, which would be street mode. Home life has much more to do with quality of life, longevity, investing in the things that you want to have there after you retire. Um, but something to remember is that in your work life mode, in your cop mode, you have plenty of courage you're utilizing. In order to have courage, you need vulnerability, and this is from the work of Brene Brown. But at home, you also have plenty of vulnerability, hopefully. It's just that you're not being vulnerable with your life so much as with your heart and with connectedness to those who you love. So if you can apply what you have as kind of that common thread through all of this, it might help make it easier to switch between these modes. This is kind of the idea. If you walk home, if you walk into your door at home and you're carrying the weight of the day with you, I like to say that unprocessed trauma is contagious. So whether it's from that day or from 10 or 15 years ago, you're still carrying it around with you, and your brain is so connected to the brains of those around you, it actually becomes contagious and can get passed on to those you love. One of the officers who trains with me said, "Who do you want kissing your wife goodnight? A police officer or her husband? Who do you want putting your kids to bed at night? A police officer or their dad or mom?" And so if you think about it that way, it's hopefully, if you don't already have a way to kind of switch out of that work mode before you get home, most people don't have trouble switching into it. But if you can switch out of it more easily and be intentional about it, you will likely notice better quality of life, home life overall. So this is a great book to just passively aggressively buy and give to your family. I'm just kidding. It's a great book that I recommend for family members of law enforcement. It really covers a lot of just what families need to know, how they can be more prepared to become a police family or to adjust to it if you already are that. And then I will leave this slide up as we take a break here. It's just a list of some of the challenges for your family as a police family. I think there's a lot of conversation that can go on around this whole topic. I'm looking at possibly some groups coming up and maybe some post-board training that you can bring your significant other to, where you get credit, but they can come along, and it's really built for couples because this is such an important thing. And right now, with support feeling undermined in many ways, we need to plug it in where anywhere else that we can. So let's take just a brief break because I still want to try to get out early. Let's come back at 4:10. And please put any questions you have in the chat box. All right. It is 11 after, so let's pick back up. So we talked about support. We talked about, we started with sleep and non-sleep deep rest. We covered a little bit about exercise, nutrition, hydration.
I'm right here.
I'm gonna mute you real quick. Nutrition, hydration are right up there with exercise as far as being the fuel you put in your body, making sure you're hydrated. If you don't keep water with you and drink it regularly and really need to use the bathroom every couple of hours, you're probably dehydrated. Most people run dehydrated. It's really a simple, quick thing you can do that will boost the way your whole system works, not just your brain, but every organ and cell in your body need plenty of water to function correctly. And then we talked about support. So connectedness at home and needing to switch between having support at work, feeling supported, and then being able to be connected at home. We talked a little bit earlier about mindset, so I won't go too deep into that, just given the time constraints. That's okay. Alex just messaged me. It's making me laugh. But this is just a little piece about living a balanced life. I won't get into it too much except to say that if if this is a pie chart of your life, looking back on it, let's say that a third of your time is spent sleeping. Hopefully, you will eventually sleep 8 hours a night on average. If a third of it is spent working, and what are you going to do with that other third? And so that is the time that you have. Time is short, life is precious and short. And so making sure that you really protect that the way that you would protect anything that's important to you. Invest in the things that you want to still have there beyond retirement, and make sure that you have enough to do that gets your mind off, like I said, the past and the future narrative thinking. So enough that you do that you're engaged in that keeps you off that future and past orientation. Okay, so let's talk about the last resiliency piece, which is access to professional care. Specifically, access to occupationally competent professional care is important. You never want to have to explain for the first few sessions to somebody how your job works and why you operate the way you do. Much better if they already understand it. There is getting to be more and more occupationally competent therapists. We are working with lots of agencies, and this year got really busy. We're not taking on more agencies for the remainder of this year, except for the ones who are kind of already in the works with us, or on their way to getting on board with us. But I have trained other therapists, about a dozen of them, in how to work with law enforcement. So hopefully this will just continue where there are more and more people. I would like everybody connected to someone who knows how to help, so that if you ever need it, you know who to reach out to. Somebody asked us to kind of recap the resilience factors again. So they are sleep, exercise, feeling supported, living a balanced life, mindset is the other one. We talked about knowing your why, and making sure that you have intention, purpose, and clarity, and kind of what is your perspective to your work, to your life as a whole, to your family life. Generally, optimism is a good idea as far as having a strong mindset, knowing that either, even if things aren't okay or good right now, they will be in the future, and that you have some control over helping it be that way is a healthy mindset. And then also knowing that if your mindset has suffered and it isn't where you'd like it to be, it's probably a stress response. So some people think of it as a character flaw or something, but I think of it's a stress response. The thoughts that you have can take a hit, and your attitude can take a hit when stress has stepped up. So the sixth one is access to professional care. Living a balanced life is the fifth one. So these are some of the barriers to care for law enforcement. And I just like to kind of point them out here because
they have been strong, big barriers to care until more recently. So the first one I want to address, I've mentioned already, stigma. Even if you have access to occupationally competent care, it doesn't make too much of a difference if you have so much stigma about mental health care that you're not going to access it. So certainly access has increased, but part of that access is your willingness. So your personal sense of stigma towards mental health care is the most important. We can't control all of law enforcement or all of, our social attitudes towards mental health care, but it's certainly improving. And so I hope that you can really take a look at your own sense of stigma. If you can think of the health of your brain and your mind as equal to and parallel to your body's health, just like you need to take care of your physical body, that's usually the best way of looking at it. These are different types of care that you can access. So talk therapy is one. There are certain skills that therapists have in talking with you that can help you problem solve and work through things, and potentially couples therapy is talk therapy as well, so that you can come to better understanding with those you care about. Sometimes unloading kind of stressors on a professional versus at home or with peers is what some people use it for. Kids and household members, if your agency has a wellness program, almost all of ours include access to care for any household family member. And so we end up seeing spouses, significant others, kiddos, whatever that might be. And then I also want to make sure to talk about ART, or accelerated resolution therapy. This is a type of trauma treatment where we use eye movement therapy for helping resolve or lessen the effects of trauma. So I'll just give you a brief explanation of this. There are hundreds or thousands even of law enforcement officers in Minnesota who've used it. It's definitely the best trauma treatment that there is, partly because of how effective it is, how quickly it works, and also what a low dropout rate there is for eye movement therapy as a whole. EMDR is the one that most people have heard of. It's been around for a few decades now. It's well researched. It's used in the military, as is ART, or accelerated resolution therapy. All of the staff at my practice are trained, or the one who isn't is about to get trained this year, hopefully. And that's because it is such an effective and efficient method. It works really well with law enforcement because you're all very motivated. Nobody wants to come sit on in our offices every week for a couple of years. People want to feel different and function better and just get on with life. And so we love that too. So we are really like an upstream approach, and we try to help get people feeling like they want to and on their way as fast as possible. We also have a limited number of sessions to work with, which helps us learn to be very efficient in our care. So eye movement therapy works in two different ways. One is it uses eye movements, which are calming to the amygdala. There's good research that shows that that is one effect that the eye movements have. Is the amygdala, like I said, is sort of a fear center in your brain, which can be kind of the source of the alarm bells that can go off when you have post-traumatic stress symptoms. So the eye movements are calming, and then it also uses memory reconsolidation. So like I said, you can get those images or scenes that will pop up or replay in your brain, and they're vivid, and you don't want them there because they're not fun to think about or look at. And they are there because they have that emotional weight to them. They have that stress response tied to them. So what ART does, or eye movement therapy, is it pulls that emotional response from the actual memory. And then your memory can reconsolidate. It can get filed away properly in your long-term memory so that it doesn't continue to cause you symptoms and problems. And then your brain won't feel like that scenario is still kind of present with you. It won't keep predicting that that is still happening or that it's about to happen. So that's kind of the quick version of how how ART works. Generally, a good way to think about therapy versus how it's traditionally been thought of as needing to include a diagnosis. Traditionally, it's been thought of as disease treatment. The question has been, what's wrong with you? Our perspective, our programming is called Power Police Officer Wellness by Enhancing Resiliency. Our model of a program and our approach to law enforcement mental health care is more like coaching or assisting. We really like to just capitalize on the resiliency and strength you already have, enhance that, help these factors fall back into place if they are out of place, maybe treat the trauma. We like to get at the core experiences that led to these stress symptoms you're experiencing. And so the question is then, what happened to you? Not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. So ART can address the fragmented ways that memories are stored. Like I said, they get stored kind of vividly and in pieces, and it can help integrate all of that and get it filed away. We are a brief, focused upstream approach, which is a good way to go about it. We'd love if more people can recognize the early signs of stress and the way that it stacks up and get on top of it and keep that number on the spectrum down low instead of it creeping up maybe when you aren't noticing, kind of behind your back if you're unaware of it. And then, one day you just can't ignore it anymore is too often what we see. So we would love to get ahead of it, really be an upstream approach, more on the preventative side, but certainly it's very understandable when it creeps up and ends up being pretty significant. So these are some complementary treatments. Sometimes people will come in for therapy sessions beyond the check-ins. Check-ins are not therapy. It's a conversation or a consultation. Beyond that, people can choose to use more sessions, and sometimes they will use ART. They'll use talk therapy, maybe couples therapy, but maybe they want to try other modalities as well, or in addition. And so these are just a few of them. Neurofeedback is a good one. I can't get into it because of time today too far, but it's a good option. It essentially helps your brain regulate. So remember that statement about your ability to be happy and connected to others is based on your ability to feel regulated and have your body's balance, budget balanced. Neurofeedback helps that in an electrical way. Medications help in a chemical way, and what we use with ART helps in an imagery way. So couples therapy, if you are in need of couples therapy, I usually suggest taking a look at a therapist who is trained in EFT, so emotionally focused therapy. It has the highest success rates of all couples therapies and is based on theories from John Gottman, who is a long-term couples researcher. And so that's going to probably be your best bet. Somatic experiencing, some people need drug and alcohol treatment. I will say that about 25% of law enforcement have an alcohol or drug problem, but from what I can tell over the last few years of work with thousands of officers, I would say that it's more like half of that 25% who legitimately have a primary issue of alcoholism or drug addiction. It's more often a problem of self-medicating. And so the problem is actually the traumatic experiences that occurred. And so when we get at those and treat the actual source of trauma, then the self-medication will ease up or stop. Massage and body work is helpful. Like I mentioned, I'm a yoga teacher. I haven't taught in quite a while, but the tension you hold in your body is stress, and it's a way that stress sits in us. So any of these things are helpful. And then I mentioned OLLY for sleep and medication. Certainly there are plenty of officers using prescription medications to try to kind of even out and regulate how they feel. Hopefully in addition to therapy, because the best route is to use both medication and therapy together. All right, just 1 second here. I'll be right back. Okay, so put any last questions you have, please, in the chat box here as I'm finishing up. I'm going to try to get you out of here by about 4:30, just a little bit early. We didn't take long breaks, so I think also I'll give you one suggestion as far as homework to help us get out early here. So as we age, I like to just point out that it is not inevitable that we go downhill in our health, in our resiliency, in our functioning. Degeneration is not inevitable. So you certainly have some sort of genetic makeup that created part of who you are and where you're headed as far as health and wellness. But there's so much that you have control over. So smoking, making sure you don't smoke, minimal alcohol use. With alcohol, keeping it at least a couple of hours away from sleep is going to help. Alcohol may sedate you and give you some of the effects that you might be looking for if you're using it to medicate stress symptoms, but it will ultimately keep you out of the sleep cycles that you need and dehydrate you potentially and can actually either kick the can down the road or even worsen the stress symptoms that you're having or the secondary effects of those stress symptoms. Using exercise, making sure you stay a normal body weight, having warm, stable relationships. These are all really important protective factors that keep you healthy as you age. And then the last thing related to the zebras that we talked about, which I know is weird, but hopefully that will be something you remember, is to confine your stress response to the actual time that it's needed. And if you don't find yourself able to do that, see if there are ways that you're willing to address the way that stress has stacked up for you. Keeping this ability to confine your stress response is going to give you longevity. It's going to make life and work more sustainable. And it's one of the most important things I want you to take away from today. So one of the main things that we do in my practice, which I absolutely love about the work that I get to do, is help people move from distress to enhancing their resiliency, really building on the strengths and the resiliency that you already have. It may be covered up. I think of it as like layers of an onion. You may need to kind of peel back the layers, probably address some stress accumulation, process trauma, but then essentially you're just enhancing the resiliency that already exists with you. And that can lead you to post-traumatic growth. So this is a term that refers to the way that you can end up stronger and have grown because you experienced the stress or trauma. And when you process it, you know, what doesn't kill you and you process and integrate into you makes you stronger. And that's the idea. You can't go around it or over it. You have to go through it in order to end up growing from it and ending up stronger. So that's kind of where I want to leave today with you for these first 4 hours. And please jump in here and let me know if you've got any questions before we're done. Big picture though, I hope that these 6 resilience factors are something that you keep an eye on. If you think about the scaling question that I asked you about where would you put yourself on that scale, I hope that you can think about some things that will help you move up on that scale if you aren't where you would like to be on it. This is something that me and my staff are constantly doing for ourselves as well. What do we need for our own self-care? And how to keep that balanced budget. It's never going to always be balanced, but there's a lot of people right now who really could use some deposits. So I think this is good timing to get this training in. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you being here and your input and your thoughts in the training here. You're going to get an email following the training either tonight or in the next few days, and it will include a link for you to fill out an evaluation, which I would love to hear from you about. I kind of just choose what to focus most on with those 6 resilience factors. But I really look closely at those evals. I'm always adjusting things, adding, tweaking, doing more research, and certainly it gets based on what feedback you give me. So if you can please fill out that evaluation form, you'll also get your certificate of attendance attached. I was able to take attendance here, and then I will turn in the affidavit of attendance to the post board as well within about the next week or so. So thank you for your time, and for a few of you, I will be seeing you back here. We can start our last 4 hours of the 8-hour training if you are involved in that one. But if not, either way, we're all going to sign off from this link. If you are participating in the second 4 hours, you were sent a second link to sign on to. And I will see you soon. And if not, take good care. Thank you for all that you do. We appreciate you, and stay safe.